know that according to art historian Susan E. James, the famous National Portrait Gallery portrait of Anne Boleyn doesn't depict Anne, but Mary Tudor, French Queen and Duchess of Suffolk, eye emoji. In her book, James argues that the letter B stands for Brandon rather than Boleyn. In her book, The Feminine Dynamic in English Art, 1485 to 1603, Susan E. James argues that there's a resemblance between the known portrait of Mary Tudor and the sitter in the NPG portrait of Anne Boleyn. She also argues that the famous B in the necklace stands for Brandon and not Boleyn, providing examples of how women used initial jewellery as early as in 1487. Elizabeth Brown owned an initial B with a pearl, diamond and emerald. Now, I'm not sold on the theory, but I do find it fascinating when art historians come up with plausible theories. I like my views to be challenged. I highly recommend Susan E. James's book, The Feminine Dynamic in English Art, 1485 to 1603. Well, it appears I have been summoned. Why yes, it is I, back to discussing the portraits of popular and controversial Tudor figures, because every response I got to my last video was universally positive. Everyone loved it. I was showered with praise and kisses and a ticker tape parade. Don't you go looking at the comments in that video. I did not get any negative responses. I did not get any comments that I was forced to delete. It was wonderful. After my entirely successful last video, I didn't think there was any more content to mine on the topic of Anne Boleyn and portrait identification, but this post popped up on our algorithmic feed and it piqued my interest. I mean, what's the provenance of the portrait? What history is associated with it, and why are we so sure that it is Anne Boleyn anyway? The National Portrait Gallery portrait has been owned by the National Portrait Gallery since 1882. Before then it was owned by the Reynolds Galleries, and before then there's no proven history of it before the 19th century, which in the kids lingo is sus. Curators do know that it was produced in the late 16th century by analysing both the portrait itself and the techniques used. The wood used in the picture, because it's not painted on canvas but a wooden panel, by analysing the rings we know it was felled after 1584, and the style of the painting is very much consistent with English artists of the later Elizabethan period. Art historians have long held that the NPG portrait is based on an earlier contemporary picture that has simply not survived, as artists of the time did often produce cheaper copies of prominent paintings. That's sort of unfair to the anonymous artist who did create this, as there's actually quite a few subtle, quite highly talented skills that have been used in this image, particularly the wet and wet blending used for the flesh tones and the jewellery, which is surprising for something that's supposedly a copy and most likely produced as part of a job lot set. You know, most likely one that was produced to go in a long gallery, in a display of Tudor patriotism, love for Queenie and her family, hurrah, hurrah! We shouldn't assume that mass production of images is a modern concept. Economic trends of the late 16th century saw a lot of families, a lot of once middle class families, gathering a lot of land, rising up and building new family seats in the latest architectural styles. Woollerton Hall, Longleat, Hardwick, Cantwell, Burley, Hatfield, Penshurst, Doddington. A long gallery is a key feature. It's a place, it's sort of built along the front of the property. It is long, it's a long thin room, and it's built with lots of windows so you could admire the gardens and the lands and display the good taste of the family with an art collection. You sort of march your guests up and down this gallery going, look at all my land, look at all my paintings. And with all these new long galleries to fill, they needed pictures for them. So artists produced paintings as quickly as they could. Popular orders were sets of the English kings and queens, and the NPG portrait shows how these orders were filled quite so quickly with facial patterns. A facial pattern is an approved drawing of certain notable figures. It's done on paper, and then you essentially trace it onto the canvas. You put it on your picture, you pin prick it, pencil mark it where all the features are, and you do a dot to dot of the face. You're actually able to see portions of the underdrawing in the NPG picture, and it's not unreasonable to think that the anonymous artist who created this picture may have been responsible for producing more than a few official pictures of Elizabeth I's late dearly departed mother. And when I say official, this is when we start to move into some of the sticky, oozy, chewy issues around identifying this as a picture definitely true to life of Anne Boleyn. There are many people who look at this picture, raise their finger waggling in the air and say, aha, this is Anne Boleyn. The facial similarity between this portrait and the pictures of Elizabeth are just too obvious to ignore. And you would be right. But don't you waggle that finger too confidently at me just yet. It is notable that the MPG portrait was produced after 1584. I set that bit up cleverly by talking about dendrochronology. This is when portraits of Anne Boleyn become very common. Her reputation is now as a Protestant martyr and reformer, a morally pure woman who was unfairly and malignly prosecuted. It is also after 1575 when the Darnley portrait was produced. This portrait was used to create the official face pattern of Elizabeth that was used right up until the late 1590s, and looking at an official portrait of Elizabeth made using the Darnley pattern and comparing it with the MPG portrait, mother and daughter do resemble each other. When using some of Elizabeth's earlier pre-facial pattern portraits, the resemblance isn't quite so clear. So, what's the case here? Is it that they've used a contemporary picture of Anne Boleyn to create this image, and mother and daughter look related because one grew the other inside their body? Or did they make the picture of Anne look extra Elizabethy by using the pre-approved facial pattern of Elizabeth produced after 1575? This debate would be easier to answer if there were meaningful surviving pictures of Anne Boleyn that could be used as comparison. We do have a number of pictures: the Hever Castle Rose portrait, the Belmont portrait, the Lyndhurst portrait, the Romney portrait, the Dulwich portrait, the Chequers Ring, which is notable for being owned by Elizabeth herself, and this one. I don't like how she stares at me. And these are all consistently similar with each other. This is the approved, officially accepted image of Anne Boleyn, encouraged, supported, and perhaps created by Elizabeth's government. They all match the limited descriptions we have of Anne. You know, an oval face, long neck, eyes which are black and beautiful, having an elegant figure. I mean, but those are all kind of vague descriptors, and are all these pictures based on the same lost original that was painted within Anne's lifetime? It's not known whether Anne sat down for a portrait during her short tenure as queen, and the MPG portrait clearly identifies her as a wife of Henry VIII, so this mythical lost original has to date from between 1533 to 1536. But it is likely that she did. The wives that came before and after her both had their official portraits painted. Jane Seymour was queen for a much shorter length of time. It would be strange if there was no official portraiture of Anne, and there are enough small references that suggest there was a publicly available and culturally accepted image of Anne. In 1559, for Elizabeth's coronation, Anne Boleyn featured in pageants put on by the people of London that are designed to be easily visually identifiable. In 1577, an inventory of Archbishop Matthew Parker's property on his death listed a portrait of Queen Anne Boleyn being displayed within his gallery. Parker had been Anne's personal chaplain when she'd been queen, even coming from Norfolk like her, and the two were close enough that she personally charged him with watching over her daughter. So it stands to reason that any picture he owned must have been a pretty good likeness. The inventories of John, 1st Baron of Lumley, detail his extensive art collection, and the list for 1590 refers to a portrait of Queen Anne Boleyn that may have been a full length, not dissimilar to the one produced for Catherine Parr during her queenship. There were images of Anne, most likely made within her lifetime, floating around Elizabethan England, and they would and could have formed a basis for the MPG portrait and ones like it. Certainly her imagery was strong enough that Elizabethan portraits were recognised and accepted as being accurate depictions of Anne. Now, are there any surviving images of Anne that we definitely know were from her lifetime? Yes! We have 3 confirmed images from her lifetime. Are they helpful in knowing whether the MPG portrait is a reasonable likeness? No! What we have are 3 small images. 1 is this commemorative medal from 1534 that has been purposely disfigured. 2, this is a small doodle by Hans Holbein for planning out Anne's coronation feast. And 3, this depiction in the Black Book. Okay, so the Black Book isn't as bad as it sounds. It's a register of the Order of the Garter. The Order of the Garter is one of the highest and most prestigious honours that you can get in England. It is an ancient chivalric order founded by Edward III, and Henry VIII sort of revitalised it. He commissioned this book. He loved Garter history because he loved medieval chivalry and knights and King Arthur, and how King Arthur and the Order of the Garter were it's imperial history. It helps propagate his belief of England as an independent empire, and it is crucial for his legislation in separating the English Church from the Church of Rome. And they get to wear really fancy outfits, which he also loves. On page 20, Anne is used to depict Queen Philippa, wife of Edward III and the original Queen of the Garter. So she's sort of... It's a common thing in early modern art. You depict the past by using the people of the present. It's a whole thing. But what's interesting about all these known depictions is the crucial use of heraldic imagery. Anne is identified through her personal mottos and imperial symbols, associating her with the position of royalty and with the House of Tudor. This is important for later. Oh, what's that? What's that I hear? Fingers all in the air or waggling away at me? Jess, you're forgetting the Holbein sketches? Aren't you going to discuss the Holbein sketches? Well, I didn't forget the Holbein sketches, but there's a lot to dispute and discuss about the Holbein sketches. If you don't know, Hans Holbein was Henry VIII's court-appointed painter, and he produced not only full-length portraits, but a very unique series of chalk sketches that are housed in the Royal Archives we still have to this day of key figures from Tudor court. Let's look at this first one. A chalk sketch of a woman in nightwear, labelled as Anne Boleyn Queen. There have been many opinions about this picture, a lot of them deeply unpleasant and incredibly misogynistic. This portrait doesn't seem like a woman Henry would change his religion for. Rather than the seductive Anne of legend, this woman is rather plain. A stylish woman like Anne would never let herself look like... Can it? Zip it. Shut your mouth. I don't want to be hearing such ripe, rancid horse manure opinions as supposedly academic analysis. Now, John Rowlands and David Starkey, and look, we've all got issues with David Starkey, but his work on Privy Chamber and his early work on Tudor Court is sublime. Shame about everything else. But anyway, they made the case for this being the true face of Anne way back in 1983. In the image, the sitter is wearing a furred robe over a chemise with her hair bound under a simple undercap. It was common for people of status to be seen and to greet people in their nightwear. So you would have your receiving room where you see people, and then people of status would be brought back to your privy chamber or bedroom for private meetings and discussions. It's sort of a mark of high favour. It is very normal to sit and chat with dignitaries of state in your bedroom, in your nightwear. It just is. There are contemporary mentions of Anne wearing a higher neckline, supposedly to hide a swelling on her neck. Other descriptions of this neck swelling come way after her death. For me, a more reasonable assumption on seeing this picture, if this is indeed drawn around 1533 or 1534, is that she may be pregnant. The inscription identifying this as Anne was not made at the time of the picture, but Rowlands and Starkey did note in that article that a commenter in 1590 recorded, now this is all hearsay, that it was subscribed by Sir John Cheek, physician to Henry VIII and tutor to Edward VI, and a man whose patron was none other than Anne Boleyn. Again, like Matthew Parker, Cheek was a man who was in a position to know Anne extremely well and be able to correctly identify her. The other Holbein short sketch, it is my favourite potential Anne image, even though it's definitely not Anne Boleyn. It was clearly done at the same time as the other Holbein short sketches, but it was labelled in the 17th century, most likely around 1649. It doesn't have any similarities with any known image of Anne. It's like that likely it's her. But it is my personal Anne because I just think it's a really beautiful drawing. That the woman depicted has a lot of personality. There's a sort of sharpness, like a knowingness in her eyes that just really appeals to me. But I'm not under any illusion that this is, her face revealed, that it's a true to life image. I just like it is all.
I just think they're neat.
With discussions of all available imagery done, let's talk about the MPG portrait itself. Is it in keeping with Tudor depictions of queens and the imagery used by Henry's other wives? The MPG portrait is supposed to be based on a lost original painted from 1533 to 1536, when Anne was Henry's acknowledged wife and queen. The fashion of the woman depicted does match the early 1530s and is similar to known items from Anne's wardrobe. She was known to wear a lot of darker colours, and even beyond trying to match this outfit specifically to one of Anne's, which I think is an impossible task, she is wearing black, and black was an extremely expensive fabric colour due to the difficulty in Tudor fabric dyes achieving true black. So it was favoured by the highest circles of the aristocracy. The woman wears furs on her sleeves, she's wearing pearls, so again we're seeing evidence of wealth. But doesn't this picture seem a little plain? Let's compare the MPG portrait to official court images of Anne's predecessor and successor. Catherine of Aragon here is dripping in wealth. She is covered in jewels, from her necklace to a giant brooch, the rings on her hands, the gemstones on her headpiece. Jane Seymour is the same. Gems on her headpiece, her rings, her girdle, her sleeves, the neckline of her gown, her necklace, her brooch. They're also both clearly of higher quality. Yes, the MPG picture is a copy, but there's shading and depth and evidence, a clear indication that the sitter is more than just a flat image on the board. Anne's portrait is also oddly cut off. A large portrait is more expensive, yes, and it was common to have portraits that only depicted the sitter from the waist up, but Anne's a queen. Why is she cut in the middle so shortly and inelegantly, when artists like Holbein were painting far less noble women in longer and more detailed portraits? Why isn't there more of her? Appearance is a crucial part of status, as you can tell with me. As a queen who was not from one of the great royal houses of Europe, a queen who rose up from within Henry's court itself, who faced gossip and hatred and recrimination not only from her peers, not only from the other European courts, but from the head of her own church, would she ever want to be depicted as lesser than the woman she replaced? A woman who was, legally speaking, never Henry's true wife and queen? Ask yourself, truly and honestly, whether the MPG portrait appears regal. Whether a king so keen on establishing the legitimacy of his new church and his new queen would want this to be the official image of his wife. This is where the question of heraldry comes back. I said it would. The commemorative medal of Anne, minted in 1534, uses her personal motto, "The most happy," to identify her. The Book of the Garter image marks her as A.R., Anna Regina, and uses the imperial crown, the same as the coronation sketch, to mark her not just as a queen, but an empress. She was also associated with the white falcon emblem, adopted from her butler ancestry, and the leopard, which came from the coat of arms of Thomas of Brotherton, 1st Earl of Norfolk and son of Edward I. What's key to note here is how Anne is identified by her own circle and those of the wider sphere of influence, with her heraldic imagery. It's not dissimilar to this woodcut of Catherine of Aragon at her coronation. Her pomegranate symbol was clearly used to identify her with the wider public outside of court. So, Anne used imperial heraldic imagery in artistic depictions that were to be seen by others and by the public. That begs the question of why the MPG portrait doesn't carry any imperial or royal Tudor imagery. Her identifying symbol is the bee necklace, right? That's how we know it's Anne Boleyn, this necklace that's been replicated and packaged and been sold all over the world, this proud marker of her Boleyn heritage and her independent identity. Do you see where I'm going with this? The logical sense for Anne, as a queen and part of the royal imperial family, to continue to promote herself as part of the Boleyns, it's just not there. She did not identify herself as a Boleyn when she was queen. She promoted herself as a descendant of Plantagenet royalty, a member of the Earldom of Ormond, and an imperial consort. There was no value to presenting herself as a Boleyn. She's now a member of the House of Tudor, a member who is still having to fight to prove her legitimacy to her country and to the political forces of Europe. There is absolutely no reason why Anne, as a queen, would be painted with an emblem that she would not have any purpose to use. Of course, it does fulfill our modern sensibilities around Anne as a proto-feminist figure who kept her independent identity, but it doesn't make any sense for any official royal portrait, commissioned and paid for by Henry, to show her as Mistress Anne Boleyn, daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, with no title or position of her own. Remember, she also held aristocratic title in her own right, and there's nothing there from that. This portrait is more similar to one of a simple gentleman's daughter, unmarried, than an anointed imperial queen. So that only draws into question even more the supposed origin of the mysterious original portrait. I can't agree with the idea that the MPG portrait was based on an original court portrait from Anne's queendom. It is possible that the original picture was from before being a queen, a picture that was still enough to be recognised visibly as being Anne and taken to make the facial pattern. However, it is the fashion to speculate wildly about these things. So, okay, let's talk about it. What if the original 1530s painting wasn't Anne? Susan E. James is right that initial jewellery was used frequently by women of the period, and it would therefore make more logical sense for this to be a woman whose married surname began with a B. Mary Tudor, Queen of France, wife of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and Anne Boleyn share certain similarities in their features. Oval faces, dark hair, pale skin, long necks, and quite prominent noses. It does beg the question whether the artist or artists responsible for producing the 1584 MPG portrait misidentified a portrait of Mary Tudor, Duchess of Suffolk, as being Anne Boleyn. Looking at the production date, the bee necklace, the facial similarities as proof in their eyes that it was a portrait of Anne. At that point in time, there would have been no one really who knew Anne well enough in life to state for certain whether it was a true likeness, whether their identification was correct. We cannot assume that people in the past did not make mistakes, whether unintentionally or purposefully. It might be that we're amplifying a misidentification made by one guy 500 years ago, or we're continuing in perpetuating an intentional lie that was made in order to create a non-controversial but easily identified image of a woman once hated and vilified, but then required to be a part of the national consciousness. And misidentification of Tudor portraits is a long tried and tested fun game for art historians of all ages. You probably already know this portrait. It's a full-length image of Catherine Parr currently on display in the National Portrait Gallery, wearing a costume that's been faithfully reproduced by costume historians and period dramas alike. And you also probably already know this painting was famously misidentified for years. Art historians couldn't believe that this woman was Catherine Parr. She's that older nurse for Henry VIII, the demure and religious woman who could never be depicted as young and beautiful and fashionable. My dog is under this desk right now. She wants blooping. Bloop, bloop, bloop. No. This had to be Lady Jane Grey, obviously. A girl who became as important as Lady Jane Grey couldn't have gone without having her portrait painted. So, stands to reason. Bloop, 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 bloop. This is how our desire to match a name to a face often overrules the facts. For decades, people ignored the relative obscurity of Lady Jane Grey, that she was a child of 8 when this image was painted, and that the jewellery depicted matches the inventories and descriptions of jewellery worn by the Queens of England, because this picture didn't match their idea of how Catherine Parr ought to appear. Tudor portraits are pretty notorious for being mislabelled and attached to more famous sitters that are almost certainly not depicted. There's a strong desire to have a quote unquote real depiction, a true to life image, as if we can somehow discern the truth about a person through pigment and paint. And quite frankly, a dealer can demand a higher price and more press attention if they announce they've got a long lost portrait of a famous or tragic Tudor figure. Bloop 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 bloop, we blooping. And don't imagine that this is necessarily a feat of modern phenomenon either. Some of these portraits have had hundreds of years worth of false identifications, false provenances, and sometimes false inscriptions. This portrait had the real name of the sitter painted over hundreds of years ago, transforming this striking image of Frances Walsingham, Lady Sydney, into Mary, Queen of Scots, more valuable, more interesting as an owned piece, and entirely misleading. That's not the only famously false picture of Mary either. NPG 96 was misidentified as Mary for a long time as well, and I can't believe I'm having to talk about this picture again. That was my dog. This picture became associated with Catherine Howard and shaped public perception of her character. Instead of seeing her as a teenage girl having to marry a 50-year-old man, this image created an idea of Catherine as being mature, knowing, a manipulator who knew what she was doing as she made men dance to her tune. That, of course, is nonsense, considering she was a child. A literal child. A literal fucking child when a man first took advantage of her. It was also used to argue that Catherine Howard wasn't a beauty, so she was tricksy and cunning to get men. And why do all of these end up with just blatant excuses to be awful about women? My God. Anyway, the picture's now more commonly associated with Elizabeth Seymour, sister to Jane and daughter-in-law of Thomas Cromwell, due to the painting's long association with the Cromwell family, as in being owned by them for several hundred years. Why would they have a random picture of Catherine Howard? Everyone's searching for an image of someone who, through the passage of time, through loss of artefacts or purposeful destruction, remains faceless. We want them to regain their identity. We want them to be how we envisage them. We want them to provide answers to the questions that are still unknowable. What did you know? What did you think? How much did you do? Any portrait without immediate identification will be immediately associated with a famous or tragic figure of the age. The MPG portrait, in its own way, is no different. There have been many portraits of brunette women from within 100 years of Anne's life who've been mistakenly or purposefully slapped with her name. For attention, for notoriety, out of a sheer bloody-mindedness that somehow, some way, will find our version of Anne out there. The Anne that we hold close in our hearts, the way we understand her, this proto-feminist hero, the wronged victim, the schemer and deceiver, the Protestant martyr or doomed courtesan. And that's not to discount how profitable lying is, because it's highly profitable, and not just on YouTube. You can make a great deal more money claiming your portrait of dubious provenance is actually Henry VIII or one of his wives or Mary Queen of Scots, or, you know, just pick any figure at all. Round up, pick up any Tudor figure, claim your portraits of them. Fraud is extremely common and prevalent in the art community, with an estimated 40% of artworks for sale at any given point actually being fake. Confirming and identifying historic portraits relies on documentation and forensic analysis, true, but also often the word of one or two experts, and there can be hugely varying differences in critical knowledge, integrity, and common sense. The incentives are huge, the chances for discovery low, and the rewards, well, they're practically limitless. Let's return to the initial starting point that caused this fever dream of a ramble. Is the MPG portrait an actual portrait and therefore likeness of Anne Boleyn, or actually of Mary Tudor, Queen of France and Duchess of Suffolk? To answer that question, we need to answer a further series of questions. Yes, we do. Firstly, was this portrait created and conceived to be a depiction of Anne Boleyn by the artist who made it? We're not asking whether it's accurate or made using a mysterious contemporary image that's been lost. No. Was this portrait understood within the time it was created to be a depiction of Anne Boleyn? Was that the intent? Yes. I think it's clear, given the overwhelming amount of imagery from the later Elizabethan period that was all created within a similar time frame, that this portrait was purposefully made to be Anne Boleyn, now redeemed as mother of Elizabeth I and the Elizabethan Anglican Church, all respectable, blah 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 blah. An official face pattern was made for Anne, as well as an official look, something that was recognisable, publicly recognisable as being her from the 1530s and matching the general known descriptions of how she looked. My dog's upset, this is taking a long time. This brings up a second question. Was this portrait created using an earlier image painted from life? Now that's a toughie for sure. Common sense would suggest, on the basis of probability, that Anne had an official portrait within her lifetime, and this picture was either destroyed or has been subsequently lost. We know that other portraits were in the possession of those who had connections with her, so presumably had a reasonable likeness. However, it does not automatically follow that these would have been used to create the MPG portrait. After all, this is an image made using an officially approved facial pattern to be bought by those who would have been completely unable to tell whether or not their picture actually looked like the real Anne Boleyn. Mass production is not an entirely new creation after all, and the aim is to satisfy the needs of a client rather than creating an outstanding work of English Renaissance art. The famous bee necklace might also be a nod towards that. Rather than being an artist genuinely confusing a portrait of the Duchess of Suffolk to be Anne, it might be an artist's way of ensuring a client knows that this is a picture of Anne. See? This is B. B for Boleyn! My job here is done! There is a tendency amongst some to infantilise those in the past, to assume their naivety and humble ignorance, as if they were the babes and we are the mighty adults blessed with knowledge. Look, grifting is nothing new. Neither is state propaganda. I find it telling that these mass-created images of Anne were produced following the Elizabeth Darnley face pattern, even if there was a popular cultural image of Anne Boleyn in the minds of Elizabethan England. Finally, we need to ask ourselves, why are we so obsessed with finding the true face of Anne Boleyn? In all likelihood, the MPG portrait was created as a produced image, not unlike the collections we see of medieval kings, or when marketing companies need to create a generic non-copyrighted image of a princess the Disney Corporation have claimed ownership of. It's almost as if we decided that finding a picture of Anne will solve the mysteries we have about her, as if we could discern a deep hidden truth if we could be eye to eye with her. I do think that there is a high possibility that one of the Holbein chalk sketches is of Anne, but I'm honestly not invested in having a definite image of what she looked like. I was going to go on this big diversion about the ideology of high Renaissance art and naturalism and how the modern idea of photorealistic imagery has poisoned how we interpret images from the past, but then I scrapped all of it because really, I don't think it matters. The MPG portrait is our popular image of Anne Boleyn as it was intended to be within its own lifetime. The imagery of Anne Boleyn was purposefully created, and like all successful marketing campaigns, has lasted the test of time. It's become synonymous with her. It's reproduced on everything from prestige dramas to rubber ducks to those weird replica necklaces that are advertised on every vaguely Tudor blog you can find. We are never going to have a picture-perfect image of people from the 16th century. Every image that we have that survives has been curated to create a certain impression, a meaning, a projection of divine authority or might or beauty or classical virtues. And in that vein, it is fitting that our most known, our most circulated, our most synonymous image of Anne was created to give her a respectable, recognisable and universally accepted image that's quietly dignified and not controversial in any way. Having a specific image of her would also remove the reminder of why we have no imagery of Anne Boleyn. Her image as queen was destroyed and vandalised following her state-sanctioned murder by her husband and king. Her facelessness is a conscious act intended to shame and permanently mark her as infamous, harking back to the acts of damnatio memoriae conducted by ancient Roman emperors, transforming her memory into permanent denigration and condemnation. And yet, despite this, Anne Boleyn remains. She will always be shrouded through time, a figure seemingly so close and yet unable to be caught. Her ability to be transformed into the icon we want to see has seen her celebrated, memorialised, reclaimed time and time again. Having a definitive image of her, judging her looks and whether she was beautiful enough or smart enough or satisfies the narrow standards by which we hold women, would lessen the power she still has over us. We blooping. We're doing videos about Anne Boleyn. This is why I kept getting distracted. Say hello, everyone. Say hello, Ruby.